we had an interview this week where part of the conversation was just discussing the economic success of the US, and they said, "Well, why do you think the US is such a successful economy?" And they wanted me to say property rights. And yes, I think that is part of the picture. Everything you brought up at the start, Alex. But I said, sure, I know what you want to say, but ever since I've discussed with Alex what's happened with the IMF and the World Bank, the economic imperialism, I think a lot of the success has come from that. And, if the UK has also benefited from it, I actually just feel a lot of shame in this. And so I don't know how to reconcile the two. But do you think we're too ashamed to admit this? And do you think we should be making this part of the conversation? I mean, do countries like the US and the UK actually have to take responsibility for this, or will they ever?
Oh, that's such an important question. The logic of power is to run out the clock. So like Alex was saying, the powerful people who are responsible, like directly and personally, for specific atrocities. Sure, they're part of a larger structure, they're part of a machine, but they have participated actively in that machine. Their logic is to simply kick the can, create FUD, fight court battles, exit, make themselves inscrutable until they die. And to secure their inheritance and future generations in such a way that they're largely insulated from any blowback. And so then the question becomes, like in the Philippines, well, who is responsible? Marcos is dead now. The people didn't take out these loans. I mean, the American people can be convinced to support various wars, but they're not the ones directing the national security apparatus to okay, let's go for Angola now. Okay, now let's do Iraq. Okay, now we got to go to Indonesia. They're not the ones coming up with these plans. They are conscripted into strategies that they don't have really any visibility into. And so there is absolutely a truth-telling that has to happen about the colonial pasts of the United States, the UK, but I mean...
The UK has faced that, its colonial past with India. They have faced that,
but
they've
the
dealt with
question
that.
is, what is to be done? I think that's really what you're getting at. So now that we've told the truth about the role, let's say, of the United States in oppressing and extracting resources from these other countries, now what do we do as a people? Because that is what you and I and people in power today have agency over. And that gets at the question of, who are we as a republic? What values are we going to be guided by? And what are our policy priorities going to be?
Yeah, and I would just say that, look, again, we have a lot to be proud of, and we have a lot to be ashamed of. I mean, it's a nuanced picture. But I think that one thing that's distressing is to see people, if you think about why are you successful? You have values that are harmonious and productive and based on freedom, right? And then you have exploitation, right? But both domestically and abroad. I mean, let's not forget the history of African Americans in the United States. But the point is that the sad part is, instead of realizing this and as Americans confronting our history and saying we need to be less exploitative and focus more on our founding values, you see a lot of people, a lot of Americans, a lot of Bitcoiners, a lot of libertarians simping for dictators. And this is just the worst, because the enemy is exploitation. And dictators are negative on both counts. Not only are they exploitative towards foreign countries, but they're also exploitative versus all of their own people. So it's distressing to see people sort of cheering de-dollarization as if that's going to be good for China, the CCP or Putin or whatever. It's distressing to me to see people promoting the UAE's structure of government as superior to the American structure of government. I really think this is important. The way forward is to reform liberal democracies and improve them. It's not to give up on the idea of limited government power and go simp for some authoritarian. This is just very distressing. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen that, but it just really irks me.
Absolutely. And it gets at different understandings and conceptions of freedom. And this has been a problem as long as we have recorded history. Like in the ancient world, we often saw two different conceptions of freedom expressed in various legal, social, spiritual texts. One conception of freedom, actually in the English-speaking world, so the word freedom in English comes from an old Germanic word for friend. And so it is, you are free when you are a fully self-responsible, morally autonomous individual capable of friendship with others. You know, if you're a slave, if you're in a relation of subjugation, you have a much more limited capacity to do that. You can't freely enter into contracts, transact. Your moral autonomy is always circumscribed. And so you can't be free. In the Roman tradition, however, in the late Republic, we start to see a definition of freedom that increasingly means the power of the Lord, the Dominus, to dispose however he will with his private property. And that property includes the people who are part of his household, including his slaves, his children, his women. And so in the medieval period, for example, it was common to speak of the liberty of the gallows, which was every lord's right to have their own private execution station where they would execute people. And so there's, I think, a tension always politically between those who see freedom as their license to amass however much power they want personally and then behave with full impunity within their sphere of ownership versus a freedom that respects the moral autonomy of others and sees my part in the social world as a relation of respect and morality with you. And those competing definitions of freedom have been calcified from time to time in political ideologies, but I think that's done a disservice because neither the left nor the right actually has a monopoly on either one of these definitions. They sort of slip between them based on who they think the good guy is. And so I would suggest that a self-consistent morality and political philosophy actually emerges from this descriptive sense of a commitment to individual moral autonomy universally for everyone, regardless of station or background.
And that has to remain our compass. Like,
yeah.
Look, I mean, I would challenge, any of the critics out there who are, typical anti-American types who, are simping for some dictator. I mean, I doubt they've written a more devastating criticism of the American state and project than that book that's sitting in front of you. Mm-hmm. But what you have to understand is that the answer is not to give up on, again, limited government power and personal freedoms in exchange for law and order statism. That's not the answer. Mm-hmm. The police state is not the answer. The police state's the enemy. So let's make sure America doesn't become more like a police state. Let's not give up on the American idea and project and go live in Dubai and praise, an absolute monarchy. I mean, that's going back in time. That's more primitive. Like, we need to find ways to protect personal freedom. We need to find ways to make the American project less vampiric on poor countries. And I think we can do that by reforming our currency, to be honest. Like, it will just happen over time if what we see in the world starts to or continues to happen, with Bitcoin becoming a bigger and bigger piece of the global economy.
This Simping for Dictators is something I've personally found particularly troubling. And
thank you for speaking up on this, Peter, by the way. You've been a big voice here on this.
And I want to come back to Bukele and discuss it with you, because that's one I struggle with. But
sure.
I've particularly been troubled by the same people who call me a statist cuck simping for dictators. It's definitely the same crowd. There's an overlap, certainly, between them.
The people calling you a statist are typically lionizing actual statists. Mm-hmm. That's the moral inconsistency here.
Yeah.
Like as long as if they're willing to say Putin is evil, Ukraine is not a fake nation. In fact, its democracy is older than the United States. If they're willing to say the CCP is committing genocide, and if they're willing to say that only 10% of the population of the UAE are actual citizens and that the whole thing is built on basically servitude and forced labor, then we can have a conversation. If they're not willing to say those things, then you know that they're just hiding.
Well, I've run into it a couple of times recently. So I've run into it on Twitter yesterday with Zuby, and I like Zuby. I think Zuby's an interesting guy. Says some interesting things. But and I'm pretty sure he's talking about Saudi Arabia. But and more broadly, I mean, he was saying if you have to pay 20 to 60% of all your money you earn to the government or go to jail, then you're free. And I was troubled by that because my response to him was saying, well, there are places where you pay 0% tax, but you can go to jail for criticizing the government.
Sure.
Right. I pay tax here. So it's kind of pick your poison. But he also discussed the idea, like he brought up a lot of 0% statistics in relation to Saudi Arabia, like the crime rates, et cetera,
Sure.
but left out other statistics that are really important. And the nuance has been lost sometimes for people to make a specific argument with skewed data or one data set, but not the whole picture. And I've become particularly troubled by it. And I don't understand how some people can have such conflicting views.
Well, it shouldn't be.
I know it shouldn't be.
Confusing. Like, as police state has low crime rate. Like, look at how much petty crime do you think happens in Xinjiang, where the Chinese government is committing genocide?
Close to zero.
Very low. How much petty crime do you think happens in Saudi Arabia or in I don't know, Pyongyang in North Korea? Very, very, very low. The state has a total monopoly on violence in these countries and exerts it at its, without any impunity whatsoever. So, and to the El Salvador point, it's entirely true. You can make a safer society by decreasing the amount of freedom that people have. That's entirely accurate. I mean, there are problems with that model, certainly, which is one of the reasons I don't think it's a good model, because it over time it can increase terrorism and it can increase violent opposition to the government if you crack down too hard. You see this in many, many, many countries. But ultimately, it comes down to, what do you stand for? If you want to come out and say that you are okay with sacrificing liberty for security, and you want to be consistent with that, that's totally fine. The problem is with people who are like Larping for freedom, who are okay sacrificing liberty for security. Those people are just hypocrites.
Yeah, so the El Salvador one I find tricky because I agree with everything you're saying, and at the same time I've visited the country,
Sure.
And it is still a democratic nation. I know he's shifted the constitution to run again, but I'm saying it's still a democratic nation. He is popular. He has dealt with a specific, very, very bad problem of gangs, and he has shifted that. He's also challenging.
But remember, democracy is just not about voting.
I know. Just bear with me. He has also challenged the IMF and the World Bank. He's run up against them, which is a good thing.
Yes, I agree.
Can there ever be a middle ground where a benevolent dictator can improve the country and then restore maybe some of the institutions that he broke down? Can this happen?
What do you think?
I think it's necessary, actually. So the act of founding something is a dictatorial act. You don't ask permission to fight a revolution to found the United States of America. You get your people together and you, through violence, instantiate a new political reality. But the question is then, what do you do after that? Once your republic is founded, do you build the institutions that then can hold and steward this new political reality without reference to any specific political personality? Or do you create a cult of personality that you then subordinate all of the structures of government to create an ongoing dependency on your particular self?
That's Bukele, what she just said.
Exactly, and that's what I worry. I mean, my biggest question for him, if I got to interview him again, would be, what next?
And Venezuelans can tell you this because they lived through this, but Chavez was enormously popular. Democracy, at least properly understood in my perspective, I know that everybody's got a different perspective on democracy. Yeah. It literally just means rule by the people in Greek. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it could be however you want to take it. But I prefer to look at it as liberal democracy, which marries rule of law with free and fair elections. I mean, that's what I think is the best way to govern in today's world. And what Bukele is doing is he's continuing to have elections, but he's destroying the rule of law, and he's removing all checks on his power, and eventually the elections won't be fair. You are going to have a tough time in El Salvador today if you're very critical of the government, which is why a lot of people just self-censor. And even people I know down there they're like, yeah, we're not going to speak out too much about the government. That would cause problems. Like, people know what's happening. And again, that might be worth the trade-off, but don't pretend like you're a freedom maximalist. Like, if you're okay with locking up tens of thousands of people without due process, I will accept that argument to increase public order and safety. But you cannot be LARPing as a freedom maximalist anymore. You are now a law and order Republican. Go for it, you know?
I mean, I've been there, and I've been in protests.
Yeah.
And people can openly protest in a way you can't in maybe other countries.
That's true. I was with you at one.
Yeah. So
but that was 2 years ago. We'll see.
Yeah. So, but that's my question.
It gets worse over time, is my point.
Of course, and I know the trajectory, and that's why my biggest questions is, what happens to the Constitution now? Is it a third election, fourth election? I actually felt like the job can't be done in 5 years.
He's ripping it up. He's going to run again, even though it says in the Constitution he can't.
Of course, but and maybe that's his version of, a revolution is doing it from within inside the government.
Yeah, or FDR. I mean, the United States.
He served a third term, didn't he? Did he serve a fourth?
Yes, but it wasn't on. We didn't change that law until after him. But I would agree, FDR's regime was terrible, especially when it comes to money and how he ruined the money standard in the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, back in those days, even the government stated more plainly what things were. So during the Second World War, FDR established an Office of Censorship. That's literally what it was called. And it specified very clearly what the rules were for journalists writing about the war. You can write about these topics. You can't write about these topics. And the press largely complied. They followed these rules. The only major exception was when they started to break the story of Los Alamos. They didn't know what was happening there. They started writing about it. And so this gets at the question of what is sovereignty. So the Nazi political theorist Carl Schmitt famously defined sovereignty in the 1930s as he is sovereign who decides on the state of exception. So there's the rule of law, and then there are exceptions. Who decides? The sovereign. And the Schmitt's attraction to the Nazi Party at that time was that he saw it as the personal dictator, as the only way to break through the inability of Parliament, of the Weimar Parliament, to get anything meaningful done. And so there is a kind of overlap between, the desire for the personal authority of the great man and authoritarianism. But they don't necessarily have to overlap. For example, like any company is a hierarchical enterprise. It is not a democracy. It is often led by, in effect, a dictator, a chief executive officer, who makes decisions and takes responsibility for the direction of the firm. If you tried to, do commercial enterprises as direct democracies, and this has been tried many times, there are certain limitations you run into really quickly. And so what does that mean? Hierarchy is a social technology. The military functions from hierarchy because you're not going to deliberate in the battlefield over every little thing. You have to have an executive decision and implement it. And so this is one of the reasons that I'm doing work in anthropology again, is because I think people have a lot of categories that are conflated, where they're like seeing Bukele as Elon Musk, as Donald Trump, as, like Viktor Orban, and like they're conflating different structures of government, different corporate forms, and they don't have a coherent theory of how all this holds together and what these different forms do.
I would also just add that I would make a call or a plea for nuance. Like, obviously, I'm very critical of Bukele's governing style, and I'm concerned about it. But I think it's awesome that he adopted Bitcoin for the country. I think it's a great move. I think it's awesome that he's trying to challenge the IMF. I maybe would contest just how much he's challenging it, given that they're still participating in all these programs and they're a dollarized country, right? But I think it's cool to experiment with volcano bonds, renewables. I think with FDR, it's worth pointing out that he did a lot of very, very positive things. He also stole the savings of America to fund the New Deal, like nuance. I think RFK Jr. has some interesting positions. I also think he has some bad ones. Like he thinks the Ukraine war is a NATO proxy war. Like that's crazy. So he has crazy positions. He has good ones. We've entered into a culture where, like, if I share a link about RFK Jr., I mean, I'll get canceled by like a lot of people on like in the centrist center left. I've seen this happen before. And this is what happened with Ron Paul 15, 20 years ago, right? Or even more recently than that. Again, I don't agree with Ron Paul's all of his positions, but he had some really good ones. But if I were to like say, oh, I think Ron Paul's thing on this is good, immediately people associate with you with all of their positions. So I just think nuance is very important. And that brings us back to the book. I mean, I think that it's about nuance. It's about being able to tell the difference between features of the American system, the global system, that are exploitative and features that are good. Mm-hmm. And it's about us working together to try to reduce exploitation and improve cooperation. And I think that giving up on the project of America just because it has had bad externalities is not a good idea. I think we need to work to correct those externalities.